The tweet appeared on the evening of Thursday, December 18th, just as the corridors of Brussels were filling with the tension that always precedes a historic shift. It was written by Robert Fico, the Prime Minister of Slovakia, a man known for saying exactly what he thinks, regardless of the diplomatic niceties usually observed at European Union summits. In his message, Fico didn't just express disagreement, he invoked a specific, violent ghost from European history. He told the world that the leaders of the EU were about to enter a closed-door meeting to discuss a massive financial decision, granting a colossal loan to Ukraine to finance its military survival. He noted, with a biting sarcasm, that everyone in the room knew his vehement opposition to this plan. And then came the line that chilled historians and political analysts alike. He said he was praying to God that no one would throw him out of a window for holding a sovereign opinion that differed from the majority. He explicitly used the term defenestration. To the casual observer, this might seem like dark humor, but words have weight, especially in the heart of Europe. The term Fico chose harkens back to the defenestration of Prague in 1618, when angry Protestants stormed Prague Castle and hurled Catholic officials from a window, a 21-meter drop that didn't just break bones, it broke the peace of a continent. That single act ignited the 30 Years' War, a conflict that raged until 1648 and left 8 million people dead, devastating the population of Central Europe. By invoking this specific historical trauma before entering a room with 26 other world leaders, Fico wasn't just making a joke. He was signaling the severity of the rift tearing through the European Union. He was acknowledging that the decision they were about to make wasn't just about money or budgets. It was about the fundamental cohesion of the bloc and the terrifying possibility of history repeating its darkest chapters. Fico posted this message, turned off his phone, and stepped into a meeting that would last through the night and into the morning of December 19th. The stakes could not have been higher. The leaders of 27 nations were gathered to engineer one of the largest financial rescue packages in modern history, a zero-interest loan worth 90 billion euros for Ukraine. The original plan, the one that had been whispered about in chancelleries from Berlin to Paris, was bold and punitive. The loan was supposed to be backed by the frozen assets of the Russian central bank, nearly 300 billion euros sitting idle in European vaults since the invasion began. It seemed like poetic justice, make Moscow pay for the war it started. But when the doors finally opened the next morning and the exhausted leaders emerged, the story had changed completely. The surprise was absolute. Yes, Ukraine was granted the 90 billion euro loan, but the collateral? It wasn't Russian money. Not a single euro of the frozen Russian reserves was touched. The aggressive plan to weaponize Russia's own wealth against it had collapsed overnight. Instead, Europe had decided to shoulder the burden itself, entering a complex labyrinth of debt and shared liability that effectively punished its own taxpayers rather than the aggressor. This outcome raises a series of profound and unsettling questions that we must unravel. Why did Europe blink? Why did they fail to pull the trigger on seizing Russian assets when the moral argument seemed so clear? Where did this massive sum of 90 billion euros actually come from, if not from the Russian coffers? And perhaps, most importantly, why is Europe willing to entangle itself in a financial mechanism that might act as a noose around its own economic neck? Welcome to Econ Empires. Today, we are going to dissect this game of high-stakes financial chicken. We will look past the press releases and the diplomatic handshakes to understand the raw fear, the legal nightmares, and the geopolitical maneuvering that led to this pivotal moment. We need to understand why Ukraine needed this money so desperately that the EU was willing to break its own rules, what role the United States played in the background, and why a small country like Belgium ended up holding the fate of the entire continent in its hands. But to understand the why, we first have to understand the scale of the disaster that was looming on the horizon. We need to step back and look at the terrifying math of a country fighting for its life. Imagine trying to run a nation that is being systematically dismantled. You are at war with a superpower. Your military expenses are burning through billions every month. Ammunition, fuel, logistics, soldier salaries. But a state is more than just an army. You still have to pay the doctors in the hospitals, the teachers in the schools, the engineers fixing the power grid every time a missile strikes. You have to keep the water running and the lights on. But your economy is shattered. Factories are bombed out or closed. Exports have plummeted because your ports are blockaded or unsafe. Millions of your tax-paying citizens have fled the country as refugees. The result is a catastrophic imbalance. Your expenses are skyrocketing while your revenue has effectively evaporated. This was the cliff edge Ukraine was facing. According to data from the International Monetary Fund and internal European assessments, the numbers were grim. For the years 2026 and 2027, Ukraine faced a financing gap of between 137 billion and 210 billion euros. This wasn't money needed to launch a counteroffensive or win the war. This was money needed just to keep the patient alive. Experts warned that without a massive injection of cash, the Ukrainian state treasury would hit zero by the second quarter of 2026. Zero. This isn't like a corporation filing for bankruptcy protection. When a state at war runs out of money, the army disintegrates. President Volodymyr Zelensky was blunt about the consequences. He warned that without immediate funding, they would have to halt the production of their most critical defensive weapon, drones. If the money stopped, the defense would collapse and Russian tanks would roll forward, not because of superior tactics, but because the defenders couldn't afford to fight. Beyond the front lines, the collapse would be total. Civil servants would go unpaid. The social contract would unravel. A state that cannot pay its doctors or police officers ceases to function as a state. This internal disintegration was a threat, perhaps even greater than the external military one. And all of this was happening against a backdrop of financial ruin. Before the war, Ukraine's debt-to-GDP ratio was a manageable sub-50%. By late 2025, it had surged to 85%, with projections pushing it well past 100% if emergency loans were factored in. Ukraine was essentially insolvent, kept afloat only by the IV drip of Western aid. The urgency was compounded by a shifting political landscape across the Atlantic. In the United States, the return of Donald Trump to the White House had fundamentally altered the equation. His administration had begun to signal a scaling back of American financial commitment, pivoting toward a strategy that prioritized domestic interests and pushed for a quick negotiated settlement. The message to Europe was clear: this is your backyard, and this is your bill to pay. The Europeans found themselves alone. They watched the clock ticking down toward that 0 hour in 2026. They knew they had to act, and they knew they had to find a solution that would not explode their own financial markets or burden Ukraine with debt it could never repay. And so the brilliant idea was born, or, depending on your perspective, the diabolical one. The logic seemed unassailable. Russia broke it. Russia should pay for it. Since February 2022, the G7 nations and the EU had frozen the assets of the Russian central bank held in their jurisdictions. We are talking about a staggering fortune, roughly 290 billion euros immobilized in the global financial system. The plan championed by Germany, Poland, and the European Commission was to use these frozen assets as collateral. They wouldn't confiscate them outright, which carries heavy legal risks, but they would use them to secure a massive loan. It's a standard financial mechanic. You get a loan from the bank, and you put up your house or your car as security. In this case, Europe would loan Ukraine the money, backed by Russia's billions. If and when Russia eventually paid reparations, the lien would be lifted. If not, the assets would be forfeit. It seemed like the perfect solution, a way to fund the war without tapping into the pockets of European taxpayers, while simultaneously sending a devastating message to Vladimir Putin. The urgency was compounded by a shifting political landscape across the Atlantic. In the United States, the return of Donald Trump to the White House had fundamentally altered the equation. His administration had begun to signal a scaling back of American financial commitment, pivoting toward a strategy that prioritized domestic interests and pushed for a quick, negotiated settlement. The message to Europe was clear: this is your backyard, and this is your bill to pay. The Europeans found themselves alone. They watched the clock ticking down toward that 0 hour in 2026. They knew they had to act. They knew they had to find a solution that would not explode their own financial markets or burden Ukraine with debt it could never repay. And so, the brilliant idea was born, or, depending on your perspective, the diabolical one. The logic seemed unassailable. Russia broke it. Russia should pay for it. Since February 2022, the G7 nations and the EU had frozen the assets of the Russian central bank held in their jurisdictions. We are talking about a staggering fortune, roughly 290 billion euros immobilized in the global financial system. The plan championed by Germany, Poland, and the European Commission was to use these frozen assets as collateral. They wouldn't confiscate them outright, which carries heavy legal risks, but they would use them to secure a massive loan. It's a standard financial mechanic. You get a loan from the bank, and you put up your house or your car as security. In this case, Europe would loan Ukraine the money, backed by Russia's billions. If and when Russia eventually paid reparations, the lien would be lifted. If not, the assets would be forfeit. It seemed like the perfect solution, a way to fund the war without tapping into the pockets of European taxpayers, while simultaneously sending a devastating message to Vladimir Putin. The plan to leverage Russian assets was poised to be the masterstroke of the summit. It had the vocal support of powerful figures like German Chancellor Friedrich Merz, who had taken office in May 2025 with a promise to take a harder line on security. He argued that using Russia's own money against it was the only language Moscow would understand. The European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen had spent months building the legal framework to make it happen. To the hawks in Europe, this was a no-brainer. It was justice served on a balance sheet. But as the leaders gathered in Brussels, this seemingly perfect plan crashed into a wall of reality. And that wall had a name: Belgium? To understand why a relatively small nation could derail the grand strategy of the entire European continent, you have to look at the geography of money. Of the 290 billion euros in frozen Russian assets, the vast majority, about 210 billion, sits in Europe. And of that European portion, a staggering 86%, or 180 billion euros, is concentrated in a single country, Belgium. Specifically, it is held in the vaults and digital ledgers of Euroclear, a massive financial services company headquartered in Brussels. Euroclear is one of the plumbing systems of the global economy, a clearinghouse that settles transactions and holds assets for clients around the world. When the plan was presented, the Belgian government looked at the numbers and realized they were being asked to paint a target on their backs. Their resistance wasn't born of sympathy for Russia, but of cold, hard self-preservation. Their objections were threefold, and each one was more terrifying than the last. First, there was the legal nightmare. The Belgian Prime Minister and his advisors knew that Russia would not take this lying down. Moscow would unleash a global lawfare campaign, suing Euroclear and the Belgian state in every jurisdiction available. They would argue that using sovereign assets as collateral for a third party's loan was theft, a violation of international customary law and sovereign immunity. Russia had already begun filing preemptive lawsuits in its own courts against Euroclear. If Belgium agreed to the EU's plan, they could be tied up in litigation for decades. The legal fees alone would be astronomical. Furthermore, the uncertainty would act like poison for Euroclear's business model. Euroclear holds over 40 trillion euros in assets under custody. Its entire business depends on trust. The trust that when a central bank or sovereign wealth fund parks its money there, it is safe. If China, Saudi Arabia, or India saw that Euroclear was vulnerable to political seizures, they might pull their assets. A run on Euroclear wouldn't just bankrupt a Belgian company, it could destabilize the euro itself and trigger a financial crisis that would make 2008 look like a hiccup. The credit rating agency Fitch had already placed Euroclear on negative watch, just due to the discussion of seizing assets. The risk was existential. Second, there was the fear of direct economic retaliation. The threats coming from the Kremlin were not subtle. Moscow conveyed a message to Brussels that if this plan went ahead, Belgium would feel the consequences forever. Russia has a long memory and plenty of leverage. While Western companies have largely pulled out of Russia, there are still significant assets trapped there. Estimates suggest that European, American, and British companies still have around $127 billion in investments stuck inside Russia. Italy's UniCredit Bank alone has exposure worth billions. Russia threatened to play a game of tit for tat. If you touch our reserves, we will nationalize every single euro of Western assets remaining in our territory. We will seize the factories, the bank branches, the equipment, and the intellectual property. Belgium feared that by agreeing to the EU plan, they would be the ones triggering this massive expropriation, inviting the rage of corporate Europe. Third, and perhaps most disturbingly, there was a physical threat. Intelligence briefings provided to European leaders hinted at a darker campaign. There were concerns about the safety of key personnel at Euroclear and Belgian politicians. In the shadow war of espionage and intimidation, Russia has shown a willingness to cross lines. The fear was that Moscow would launch a campaign of hybrid warfare, cyber attacks on Belgian infrastructure, disinformation campaigns, or even targeted violence, to punish the country that unlocked the vault. Faced with these risks, the Belgian government drew a line in the sand. Prime Minister Bart de Wever used a metaphor that perfectly captured their predicament. He said Belgium was willing to jump out of the plane with the rest of Europe, but only if they were sure the parachute would open for everyone. He demanded ironclad guarantees. If Euroclear was sued, who pays? If Russia retaliates against the Belgian economy, who covers the losses? He wanted the entire EU to sign a collective defense pact for his country's financial sector. But when it came time to put ink to paper, the other capitals hesitated. No one wanted to be legally on the hook for billions in potential damages. Germany, France, Italy, they all wanted the Russian money used, but none of them wanted to sign the indemnity clause that Belgium required. Belgium wasn't entirely alone in its obstructionism, though its reasons were unique. Viktor Orban of Hungary, playing his usual role as the spoiler, opposed any additional funding for Ukraine on principle, maintaining his alignment with Putin. Robert Fico of Slovakia, as his tweet foreshadowed, was ideologically opposed to fueling the war further. Even Italy expressed reservations, primarily due to the exposure of its banking sector in Russia. The perfect plan to use Russian assets was dying a death of 1,000 cuts. The unity of the European Union was fracturing under the pressure of conflicting national interests. As the night wore on in Brussels, the leaders realized they were staring into the abyss. They couldn't leave the summit without a deal. Ukraine was bleeding dry. If they failed to deliver the money, the geopolitical consequences would be catastrophic. A Ukrainian collapse would bring Russian troops to the borders of Poland and Romania, fundamentally altering the security architecture of the continent for decades. They needed a solution that provided the cash, but bypassed the radioactive issue of the Russian assets. In the early hours of December 19th, bleary-eyed and exhausted, they struck a deal. It was a compromise, a messy, imperfect, but necessary workaround. They agreed to give Ukraine the 90 billion euros for 2026 and 2027, but the source of the funds would not be the frozen Russian accounts. Instead, the European Union would borrow the money itself. They would go to the global bond markets, issue debt in the name of the EU, and pass the cash to Ukraine as a zero-interest loan. The interest payments, the administrative costs, the risk of default, all of that would be borne by the EU budget. This was a profound shift. By backing the loan with a headroom of the EU budget, the margin between the maximum resources the EU can call upon and what it actually spends, Europe was effectively taking out a mortgage on its own future. If Ukraine defaulted, which is highly probable given its destroyed economy, the EU member states would be on the hook to repay the bondholders. They chose to punish their own future budgets, rather than risk the immediate wrath of Russia. The agreement reached in Brussels was a victory for caution and a defeat for the hawks. Belgium and Italy breathed a sigh of relief. Their banks and clearinghouses were safe for now. Germany and Poland were frustrated, having lost the opportunity to strike a financial blow against Moscow. But the implications of this deal go far beyond the winners and losers of a single night. This decision set a precedent that fundamentally changes the economic nature of the European Union. For the first time, the EU agreed to issue joint debt for a war effort without the unanimous consent of all 27 members. The final deal was structured as an opt-in mechanism. 24 nations agreed to guarantee the loan. 3, Hungary, Slovakia, and the Czech Republic, opted out completely. They washed their hands of the deal, refusing to contribute a cent or accept any liability. This creates a two-speed Europe, a dangerous fragmentation where common defense and common finance are no longer truly common. It opens the door to a future where the EU is not a monolithic bloc, but a coalition of the willing, weakening its collective bargaining power on the global stage. Economically, the move to fund the war through joint borrowing carries significant risks for the citizens of Europe. By leveraging the EU budget, the leaders have reduced the bloc's capacity to respond to future crises. That headroom in the budget is like a rainy day fund. It's meant to be there for natural disasters, for pandemics, for economic crashes in the Eurozone. By committing it to Ukraine, Europe is flying without a safety net. If a financial crisis hits southern Europe in 2027, or if another pandemic sweeps the continent, the money that would have been used to bail out Italy or Spain is now tied up in Ukrainian defense. Economists warn that this could lead to austerity measures down the line. To pay back these bonds, the EU might have to cut funding for regional development, for agriculture, for scientific research. The European taxpayer is effectively subsidizing the war effort, not through direct taxes today, but through the degradation of public services tomorrow. For Ukraine, the 90 billion euro package is a lifeline, but it is a lifeline made of heavy chains. Yes, it provides the liquidity needed to survive the next 2 years. It allows the government to pay soldiers and keep the lights on. It strengthens Kyiv's hand in any potential negotiations, ensuring they don't enter peace talks as a failed state. But it is still a loan. Even at zero interest, the principal must be repaid. Ukraine is piling debt on top of debt. Finance Minister Serhiy Marchenko was grateful but realistic. He pointed out that this 90 billion only covers about 2/3 of their financing needs. There is still a gap of 45 billion euros that must be filled by others, presumably the IMF, the World Bank, or individual donor nations. The Ukrainians had desperately wanted the Russian assets seized. They argued, with considerable moral weight, that it is perverse for the victim to go into debt while the aggressor, billions, sit untouched in a vault in Belgium. They worry that this debt burden will strangle their post-war recovery. The World Bank estimates the cost of reconstruction at over $500 billion. If Ukraine emerges from the war saddled with massive sovereign debt, it will be uninvestable. It will be a zombie economy, forever paying off the cost of its own survival. The hope in Kyiv is that eventually the West will find the courage to seize the Russian assets and use them to pay off these loans, converting them into grants retroactively. But for now, that remains a hope, not a policy. In Moscow, the news from Brussels was likely met with a quiet satisfaction. Vladimir Putin had drawn a red line around the frozen assets, and Europe had blinked. The Kremlin's strategy of intimidation, the threats of lawsuits, of expropriation, of consequences forever, had worked. They had successfully divided the European alliance, peeling off Belgium and Italy through fear, and neutralizing the aggression of Germany and Poland. Putin had warned that touching the assets would be theft, and would undermine trust in the Western financial system, a narrative that resonated with the cautious bankers in Brussels. While Russia would certainly prefer access to its $300 billion, keeping it frozen is a victory compared to losing it entirely. It remains a bargaining chip. As long as the money is just frozen, it can theoretically be unfrozen as part of a peace deal. It gives Russia an incentive to negotiate, but it also gives them leverage. Furthermore, by forcing Europe to borrow the money instead, Russia has successfully transferred the economic pain of the war onto the European population. Moscow is betting on Ukraine fatigue. They know that inflation, high energy prices, and now the prospect of future debt repayment will grind down the resolve of European voters. They are counting on the rise of more leaders like Fico and Orban who will say, "Well, why are we paying for this war when we have problems at home?" By turning the financing of Ukraine into a complex debt instrument, Russia hopes to turn it into a political wedge issue in every future European election. This entire drama played out in the shadow of the United States. The return of the Trump administration loomed large over the Brussels summit. While the Europeans were arguing over bond structures, reports were circulating of covert meetings in Miami between Russian envoys and Trump's inner circle. The discussion there was about a rapid end to the war, a deal that might involve freezing the front lines and conceding territory in exchange for peace. The Europeans rushed the $90 billion deal through partly to Trump-proof the war effort. They wanted to lock in funding for Ukraine before the U.S. potentially pulled the plug or forced a settlement that Kyiv wasn't ready for. There was also a deep-seated fear about what Trump might do with the Russian assets if he got involved. Trump is transactional. There was a worry in European capitals that he might try to use the frozen assets as a bargaining chip in his own deal-making, perhaps suggesting they be used to fund reconstruction contracts awarded to American firms cutting Europe out of the process, while leaving them with the refugee crisis and the security instability. By securing their own funding stream, however flawed, Europe was trying to buy itself a seat at the table. So, where does this leave us? We have a Europe that has broken its own financial taboos but failed to cross the Rubicon of seizing Russian assets. We have a Ukraine that has been bought another 2 years of survival but at the cost of a mortgaged future. And we have a Russia that has successfully weaponized the fear of its own economic power to paralyze Western decision-making. The defenestration of Prague in 1618 kicked off 30 years of devastation because the leaders of the time failed to find a political mechanism to resolve their differences, resorting instead to violence and entrenched alliances. Robert Fico's tweet was hyperbolic, but the underlying anxiety was real. Europe is walking a tightrope. The decision to issue joint debt without unanimity is a crack in the foundation of the Union. It suggests a future where the EU is less a unified superstate and more a loose collection of regional interests, vulnerable to external pressure. The failure to seize the assets also reveals the limits of Western economic warfare. We built a global financial system based on the free flow of capital and the sanctity of property rights. Now we find that those very principles are being used as a shield by an aggressor state. We are trapped by our own rules. We cannot seize the money without breaking the legal certainty that makes the euro and the dollar the world's reserve currencies. It is a paradox of liberalism. To defend the liberal order against an autocratic aggressor, we are afraid to violate the liberal principles of property, even when that property belongs to the aggressor. As we look ahead to 2026, the question of the frozen assets will not go away. The 90 billion euros is a stopgap. It buys time, but it does not buy victory. If the war drags on into 2027, or if the reconstruction costs spiral, the pressure to revisit the Belgium option will return. The US, under Trump, might exert pressure from the other side, demanding Europe pay more. The internal politics of the EU will become more volatile as the debt burden becomes real. The game of chicken continues. Europe swerved this time, choosing the safer, more expensive path of self-funding. But the road is long, and the Russian bear is still sitting on the tracks. The ultimate cost of this war will be paid by someone. The question remains, will it be paid by the aggressor's frozen billions, or by the future prosperity of the European citizen? For now, the window remains closed. No one was thrown out, but the glass is cracking. Thanks for reading Econ Empires. The world of geopolitical finance is complex, where the movement of money is just as lethal as the movement of armies. We will continue to track these shifts, decoding the decisions made behind closed doors that shape your economic reality. Stay tuned, because in this game, the rules change every day.